welcome to Get Creeped Nighttime Stories. If you enjoy any of these stories, please leave a like so the algorithm can share this to more like us, and subscribe for more stories like this, if you dare.
The summer of '96 was supposed to be the best of my life. I'd just turned 19, had my first real girlfriend, and discovered what Jack Daniels could do to a lightweight like me. But that August morning, stumbling through my parents' front door with the mother of all hangovers, everything changed. The house was wrong, too quiet, no TV blaring Dad's morning news, no smell of coffee, no sound of the ancient Mr. Coffee machine gurgling away like it had every morning since I was 5. Just dead silence that made my hungover brain scream danger. Then I saw her. Mom sat at the kitchen table like a statue, wine glass in hand at 10 in the fucking morning. She never drank before dinner. Never. The sight of her made me jump so hard I nearly puked right there on the linoleum. The same ugly yellow linoleum we'd had since forever, with the burn mark from when I'd tried to make pancakes at age 7 and nearly torched the place. She told me to sit down, her voice flat as roadkill. That's when I knew. Something had happened to Dad. My legs felt like jelly as I pulled out the chair. The one that always squeaked. The one Dad kept saying he'd fix but never did. Mom's eyes were red-rimmed, mascara smudged. She'd been crying. The wine bottle on the table was already half empty. I asked her what was wrong, where Dad was. She took a long sip, hands shaking so bad the wine nearly sloshed over the rim. Then she said he was gone. My heart stopped. I asked if he was dead, the words barely making it past the lump in my throat. She shook her head, and for one brief moment, relief flooded through me like cool water. Then she said the words that would haunt me for the next 2 years. He just left. Packed a suitcase and left. No note, no explanation, nothing. The room spun, and not just from the hangover. I told her that was impossible. Dad wouldn't just leave. He had work on Monday. He had that big project. She cut me off. He wasn't going to work on Monday. She'd called his office. He quit last week. Didn't tell her. Didn't tell anyone. Just quit. I stared at her, trying to process this. My dad, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike in our driveway, who'd taken me to see Jurassic Park 3 times because I was dinosaur obsessed, who sang along to Creedence Clearwater Revival every time it came on his beat-up truck's radio, had just vanished. I managed to ask when. She said yesterday, maybe the day before. She didn't know. She thought he was at work yesterday, but then she laughed, the kind of laugh that made you want to cry. But he wasn't, was he? He was probably already gone. The next few months were a blur of relatives checking in, casseroles appearing on our doorstep, and Mom alternating between crying jags and explosive anger. She'd go from sobbing into her pillow to throwing Dad's belongings into garbage bags while screaming about what a selfish prick he was. I tried talking to her about it, tried to understand why he'd leave, but she'd either dissolve into tears or fly into a rage. She'd scream at me not to talk about that piece of shit, that he was dead to her. But I couldn't let it go. This wasn't some stranger we're talking about. This was my dad. The guy who'd stayed up with me all night when I had the flu, who'd driven 6 hours to pick me up from summer camp when I got homesick. He wouldn't just abandon us. Something had to be wrong. So I started digging. My first call was to Carl, Dad's only real friend. They'd been tight since their college days at Oregon State, back in the early 70s. If anyone knew where Dad might have gone, it would be Carl. When I told him what happened, Carl couldn't believe it. He asked if I was serious, if Dad had really just left. I confirmed it and asked if he'd heard from him. Carl said not a word. Last time they'd talked was maybe 2 weeks ago. Dad had seemed fine. They were planning to go fishing next month. Then he went quiet, told me to hold on while he thought. I waited, phone pressed to my ear, listening to Carl breathe and think. Outside, I could hear the neighbor kids playing. Their laughter felt wrong, out of place in this new world where fathers could just vanish. Finally, Carl said there were a few places Dad might go. He knew my dad, how he always talked about getting away from it all. There was his hometown, Lincoln City. There was Portland. He had some old work contacts there. And then I pressed him to continue. Carl said it was a long shot, but Dad had spent a summer up in Canada when they were in college. Little place called Wrigley, way up in the Northwest Territories. He'd loved it up there. Always talked about going back someday. Wrigley, I'd never heard him mention it. But then again, how much did I really know about my dad's life before I came along? I tried Lincoln City first. Drove down in my piece-of-shit Honda Civic that leaked oil and had a cassette player that only worked if you hit the dashboard just right. The whole drive, I kept expecting to see Dad's blue Ford pickup on the highway. Kept imagining I'd find him at his favorite diner on Highway 101, eating eggs over easy and reading the paper like nothing had happened. But he wasn't there. I checked every motel, every diner, even drove by the house where he grew up. Now a vacation rental painted an ugly shade of pink. Nothing. Portland was the same story. His old co-workers hadn't heard from him. His favorite bar hadn't seen him. It was like he'd been erased from existence, which left Wrigley. I stared at the map Carl had drawn for me, tracing the route with my finger. It was insane. We're talking about driving for 30 hours straight through some of the most remote country in North America. Through Washington, British Columbia, Alberta, and then up into the Northwest Territories. Places where you could drive for hours without seeing another soul. Where, if your car broke down, you might die before anyone found you. But what choice did I have? I told Mom I was going camping with friends. She was too deep in her grief and rage to question it. I loaded up the Civic with camping gear I borrowed from Carl. Enough beef jerky and Pop-Tarts to feed an army. And a case of Surge. That nuclear green soda that kept you wired for hours. The drive was surreal. I left Portland playing Soundgarden's Super Unknown album, watching the city fade in my rearview mirror. By the time I hit the Canadian border, I'd cycled through every CD I owned twice. The border guard looked at me like I was crazy when I told him I was headed to Wrigley. He asked if I was sure about that, said it was a long way to go for camping. I lied and said I was sure. The further north I drove, the stranger everything became. The trees got taller, the towns got smaller, and the radio stations disappeared one by one until all I could get was static and the occasional French language broadcast I couldn't understand. I stopped for gas in places that looked like they'd been forgotten by time. Ancient pumps that still had mechanical numbers that rolled over with a satisfying click. General stores with wood-burning stoves and shelves stocked with supplies for trappers and hunters. The people looked at me like I was from another planet. A kid from Portland in a Honda Civic heading to Wrigley? Might as well have been driving a spaceship. The last stretch was the worst. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt. My car bottomed out so many times, I was sure I'd crack the oil pan and be stranded. The mosquitoes were like something out of a horror movie. Clouds of them so thick you could barely see through the windshield. But finally, after 3 days of driving, surviving on caffeine and determination, I made it to Wrigley. If you could call it making it. Wrigley was barely a town. A few dozen buildings clustered around a single main road. One gas station, one store, a medical clinic, maybe 100 people, mostly First Nations. The kind of place you'd miss if you blinked. I pulled into the gas station, my car coughing and wheezing like it was about to die. The attendant, a weathered guy named Winston, who looked like he'd seen everything, watched me climb out, stretching muscles that had been cramped for hours. He said I was a long way from home. It wasn't a question. I told him I was looking for someone, my dad. I showed him the most recent photo I had. Dad at last year's 4th of July barbecue, wearing his favorite Mariner's cap, smiling at the camera with a beer in his hand. Winston studied it, shook his head. He hadn't seen him. But then he paused, looking at me with something like sympathy. He asked if I had any other pictures, older ones. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I dug through my wallet, found an old photo I'd been carrying around. Dad in college, standing next to some rock formation with a girl I didn't recognize. They were both in hiking gear, grinning at the camera. Winston's face changed. He said, "Holy shit, that was Hunter's Rock." And that girl. I asked if he knew her. He said, not personally, but he remembered when she went missing. Summer of '73. Big search party, RCMP, all over the place. They never found her. He looked at me, then back at the photo, and asked if my dad was here when it happened. My mouth went dry. I didn't know. He'd never mentioned. Winston told me I needed to talk to Chief Irwin. He was over at the band office in the clinic. He'd remember more about this than Winston would. I thanked Winston and walked to the clinic on legs that felt like rubber. The building was small, paint peeling, with a sign in English and what I assumed was the local indigenous language. Inside, it smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Chief Irwin was younger than I expected, maybe early 50s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. When I showed him the photo and explained why I was there, his expression went dark. He told me to sit down, gesturing to a chair in his cramped office. He said I needed to hear this. He told me about Susan Culver, 22 years old, fresh out of university, up in the territories for a summer of hiking and adventure. She'd been camping with my dad near Great Bear Lake when she vanished. Chief Irwin said my father had reported her missing. He came stumbling into Deline. That's the nearest town to where they were camping, saying she'd disappeared in the night. Said he heard her scream, went to help, but she was gone. I asked what happened to her. He said nobody knew. The RCMP questioned my father. Twice. Chief Irwin paused, choosing his words carefully. His story didn't make sense. He kept talking about them, saying they took her. Wouldn't say who they were. The Mounties thought he'd killed her, but they never found a body, never found any evidence. Eventually, they had to let him go. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My dad, a murder suspect, it was impossible. But then, why had he never mentioned any of this? Why had he come back here? I asked if he'd been here recently. Chief Irwin shook his head. Not that he knew of. But if Dad was heading to where it happened, he might have gone straight to Deline. It was another 200 miles north. Bad road. I'd need a four-wheel drive. I looked down at my keys. My Civic could barely handle paved roads, let alone 200 miles of wilderness track. I admitted I couldn't make that drive. Chief Irwin agreed, but even if I could, he called me son, said that was dangerous country. People go missing out there, not just 25 years ago, recently. Last year, a German tourist vanished. Year before that, 2 hunters. The land up there, it doesn't forgive mistakes. That night, I slept in my car in the gas station parking lot. Winston had offered to let me park there, even brought me a thermos of coffee in the morning. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Chief Irwin had told me. My dad, connected to a missing girl, a place where people vanished without a trace. I should have gone home. Should have driven back to Portland and tried to forget the whole thing. But I couldn't. Not when I was this close. That's when the knock came on my window. I jerked awake, heart pounding. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness you never see in the city. No streetlights, no neon signs, just stars and the faint glow of the northern lights. A face appeared at my window. A man in an RCMP uniform. I rolled down the window, trying to shake off sleep. I asked if he was an officer. He introduced himself as Constable Mackenzie. He asked if I was the kid looking for his father. Word traveled fast in a place like Wrigley. I confirmed I was. He told me he was one of the officers who questioned my dad back in '73. He shouldn't be here. Shouldn't be telling me this. But he thought I deserved to know what really happened. He handed me something. A cassette tape, the label faded and barely readable. He said it was my father's first interview before they arrested him. He told me to listen to it, then decide if I really wanted to find him. Before I could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness like he'd never been there at all. I sat there holding the tape, my hands shaking. My car's cassette player had been broken for months, only working when you hit the dashboard. But when I slid the tape in and gave the dash a solid whack, it crackled to life. My father's voice filled the car. Younger, but unmistakably him. On the tape, he was explaining that Susan went out to pee in the middle of the night. He heard her unzip the tent, figured she'd be right back. Then he heard her scream. The interviewer, must have been Mackenzie, asked what kind of scream. Dad said it was terrified, like she was being torn apart. They asked what he did. He said he grabbed his flashlight and ran out there. And then he saw. There was a pause on the tape, and then Dad's voice came back, shaky. He said they were going to think he was crazy. The officer told him to just say what he saw. There was a long pause. When my dad spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. He said they weren't human. He didn't know what they were, but they weren't human. They had her, and they were taking her apart. Not eating her, just taking her apart. like they were curious what was inside. The officer started to say something about trauma, but Dad cut him off. His voice cracked as he insisted he knew what he fucking saw. They looked at him. All of them, maybe 6 or 7, just turned and looked at him with these eyes that reflected the light like an animal's. And then they took her and ran. Not like people run, like spiders, using all their limbs. They took her into the trees and she was still screaming and he couldn't follow. He was too scared. He just stood there like a fucking coward while they took her. The tape went quiet except for the hiss of static. Then Mackenzie's voice came through, saying they were going to need Dad to come with them. Dad's response was flat. They didn't believe him. Mackenzie said they needed to continue the conversation at the station. Dad said they thought he killed her. They thought he made it up. The officer started to respond, but the tape cut off. I sat in the darkness, my father's words echoing in my head. They weren't human, like spiders, using all their limbs. It was crazy, impossible, but the fear in his voice had been real. Whatever he'd seen, or thought he'd seen, had traumatized him. And now, 25 years later, he'd come back. Why? I must have dozed off again because the next thing I knew, Winston was tapping on my window, the morning sun blazing behind him. He asked if I was okay. I wasn't. Not even close. But I nodded anyway. Winston said he'd been thinking about my dad. If he came through here, someone might have seen him. There was only one road north. He could make some calls, ask around. While Winston made his calls, I sat in the gas station, nursing bitter coffee and trying to make sense of everything. My dad had witnessed something terrible, or had a breakdown and imagined it. Either way, it had haunted him for 25 years. And now, he'd come back to face it. Winston returned, shaking his head. Nobody had seen him. But he hesitated. His cousin worked at the RCMP station in Deline. He said there had been some activity up near Great Bear Lake. Lights in the sky. Strange sounds. They sent a patrol up there 2 days ago. 2 days ago. Right around when Dad would have arrived if he'd driven straight through. I told Winston I needed to get up there. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, pointing at my Civic. He said that car wouldn't make it 5 miles on those roads. But then he surprised me. He said if I was really determined to go, he'd drive me. He had a truck that could handle it. But I'd owe him gas money and had to promise that if things got weird, we'd turn right back around. I agreed immediately. Whatever was happening up there, whatever my dad had gotten himself into, I needed to know. We left the next morning at dawn. Winston's truck was an old Ford F-150, probably from the early 80s, with rust eating through the wheel wells and a heater that only worked if you kicked the dashboard. But it had 4-wheel drive and tires that looked like they could climb mountains. The drive to Deline was brutal. The road, if you could call it that, was more like a suggestion of where vehicles might go. We bounced over rocks, splashed through streams, and more than once I was sure we were going to flip. Winston just gripped the wheel and kept driving, occasionally muttering in what I assumed was his native language. About halfway there, he started telling me stories, local legends about the area around Great Bear Lake. He said the elders called it cursed ground. Long before the white men came, Before even the oldest stories, something bad had happened there. The animals avoided it. Birds wouldn't nest in the trees. And sometimes hunters would go missing. I asked him what he thought happened to them. He was quiet for a long moment, then said his grandmother used to tell him about the Wichush, creatures that were once human but had been transformed by committing unspeakable acts. Cannibalism, usually. They became something between man and beast, always hungry, always hunting. I told him that sounded like Wendigo stories I'd heard. He shook his head. No, he said. Wendigos were from further east. The Wehug were different, smarter. They could mimic human voices, human behavior. They could live among people for years before their true nature showed. And they didn't just eat human flesh. They collected it, studied it, tried to remember what it was like to be human. The way he described them made me think of my dad's words on the tape. Taking her apart, like they were curious what was inside. We reached Deline in the late afternoon. It was bigger than Wrigley, but not by much. Maybe 500 people, a few more buildings, and an RCMP station that looked like it had seen better days. Winston parked outside and said he'd wait. He didn't want anything to do with the Mounties. Inside, I found chaos. The small station was packed with officers, some in uniform, some in tactical gear. Radios crackled with urgent voices. A map on the wall was covered in red pins and circles. A young constable noticed me and asked what I was doing there. When I explained I was looking for my father and mentioned Mackenzie's name, his face went pale. He told me to wait and disappeared into a back room. A few minutes later, an older officer emerged. Not Mackenzie, but someone who carried himself with authority. He introduced himself as Sergeant Fuller and asked me to follow him. In a small interview room, Fuller laid out what was happening. 3 days ago, a pair of hikers had reported strange lights near the old Culver campsite, the place where Susan had disappeared in '73. The RCMP sent 2 officers to investigate. They'd maintained radio contact for the first day, reporting nothing unusual. Then, 48 hours ago, they'd gone silent. Yesterday, a search team found their vehicle abandoned on the trail. No sign of the officers, but they'd found something else. Fuller pulled out a manila folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a Polaroid, slightly overexposed. It showed what looked like a shelter made of branches and mud, built against a rock face. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was what was hanging from the trees around it. Strips of something pale and leathery. At first, I thought it was animal hide. Then I saw the tattoo on one piece, a partial maple leaf, faded but recognizable. Fuller said they believed it was human skin, old, preserved somehow. They'd found dozens of these, trophied in the area. Some looked recent, others could have been decades old. I asked if they'd found any sign of my father. Fuller hesitated, then pulled out another photo. This one showed a backpack, torn and muddy, lying beside a tree. I recognized it immediately. It was Dad's old Kelty pack, the one he'd had since college, the one he'd taken on that trip with Susan. My hands were shaking as Fuller explained their theory. They believed someone or something had been living in those woods for years, possibly decades, taking hikers, hunters, anyone who ventured too far from the trails. The officers who'd gone missing were just the latest victims. I asked what they were going to do. Fuller said they were mobilizing a full tactical team. They'd be going in at dawn with helicopters, dogs, the works. They'd find whoever was responsible and bring them to justice. But I knew they were wrong. This wasn't some mountain man serial killer. This was what my dad had seen all those years ago. What had taken Susan? What had haunted him ever since? I thanked Fuller and left, my mind racing. Outside, Winston was leaning against his truck, smoking. When he saw my face, he just nodded. He asked if I wanted to go home. I shook my head. I told him I needed to go to the lake, to the campsite. Winston stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, if I was determined to die, he wouldn't stop me. But he wouldn't go with me either. He'd already lost too many friends to that cursed place. He drove me to the trailhead as the sun was setting, gave me a flashlight, some water, and a can of bear spray. Then he grabbed my shoulder and told me my father was probably already dead. Whatever was out there, it had been taking people for longer than I'd been alive. I wouldn't be saving anyone. I'd just be adding my name to the list of the missing. I told him I knew, but I had to try. The hike in the dark was terrifying. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could have been something watching me. The trail was rough, barely visible in the flashlight beam. More than once, I stumbled, nearly fell. It took me 4 hours to reach the lake. By then, the moon had risen, casting everything in silver light. The water was still as glass, reflecting the stars. It would have been beautiful if I hadn't been so fucking terrified. I found the old campsite easily enough. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze. The ground was torn up from the search teams. And there, near the water's edge, was a tent. A modern tent. Dad's tent. My heart hammered as I approached. The zipper was open, the flap moving gently in the wind. I shined my flashlight inside. Empty, but his sleeping bag was there, along with his pack. Not the old Kelty, but his newer one. A camp stove, freeze-dried meals, everything you'd need for a few days in the wilderness. I called out for him, my voice cracking. The sound seemed to die just a few feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. That's when I heard it. A voice coming from the trees. Son, is that you? It was Dad's voice, but something was wrong with it. Too flat, too careful, like someone trying to remember how words worked. I turned, flashlight beam sweeping the forest. Nothing but trees and shadows. I'm here, son. Come help me. I'm hurt. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, moving, leading me away from the campsite. Every instinct screamed at me not to follow. But what if it really was him? What if he was injured, dying, and I was too scared to help? I took a step toward the trees, then another. That's it. Just a little further. I've missed you so much. The voice was getting stranger. Words slightly out of sync, like a badly dubbed movie. And there was something else. An undertone, almost like multiple voices speaking at once. I stopped walking. Son, why did you stop? I need you. I backed toward the tent, bear spray in one hand, flashlight in the other. The beam caught something moving between the trees, a shape that was almost human, but not quite. Too tall, too thin, moving with too many joints. Come here, son. Come to Daddy. The thing stepped into a patch of moonlight, and I bit back a scream. It wore my father's face like a mask, stretched over something that had never been human. The skin didn't fit right, bunching and pulling as it moved. Behind the eye holes, I could see other eyes, black, reflective, clustered like a spider's. But worst of all was what it wore around its neck. Strips of leather decorated with hair, different colors, different textures, trophies, and hanging from its belt, fresh and still dripping. I recognized the uniform patches. RCMP, the missing officers. The thing tilted its head, my father's face sliding slightly to one side. Don't you recognize me? It's Daddy. I came back for you. I ran. Behind me, I heard it laughing, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming. Then footsteps, but wrong. Too many of them, moving too fast. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes. The beam of my flashlight bounced crazily, showing glimpses of the path. Behind me, that awful laughter got closer. Running won't help, son. We've been waiting so long for you. Jesus Christ, there was more than one. I burst out of the trees onto the lakeshore and saw him. My real father, standing knee-deep in the water, staring at something in his hands. Dad. He turned, and even in the moonlight, I could see the recognition in his eyes. The real him. But he looked broken, hollow, like he'd aged 20 years in 2 days. You shouldn't have come, he said. I thought if I came back, if I faced them, I could make it stop. But they've been using my voice, calling people, feeding. The laughter was getting closer. I grabbed his arm, tried to pull him from the water, but he wouldn't budge. They let me live back then, he said. Let me go so I could bring them more. Every nightmare, every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. And I knew they were still out here, still hungry. The things burst from the trees, 3 of them, maybe 4. In the moonlight, I could see them clearly. Pale, elongated bodies covered in stolen skin. Faces that were mockeries of human features. Limbs that bent in ways that hurt to look at. They stopped at the water's edge, hissing. Dad pulled something from his pocket. A flare gun. They don't like fire, he said, or water. It's the only reason I'm still alive. One of the creatures wearing a woman's face. God, was that Susan? Spoke in a voice like wind through bones. Give us the boy and you can go. Just like before. Dad raised the flare gun, but not at them, at the sky. I'm sorry, he said to me, for everything, for leaving, for not telling you, for bringing this curse to our family. He fired. The flare arced up, brilliant red against the stars. In the distance, I heard helicopter rotors. The tactical team Fuller had mentioned. They must have mobilized early. The creatures screamed, a sound that made my ears bleed. They retreated into the trees, but not far. I could see their eyes reflecting the dying light of the flare. They'll be back, Dad said. They always come back. Unless... He waded deeper into the water, up to his waist now. Dad, no. We can make it. Help is coming. He shook his head. They marked me, son. 25 years ago, they marked me. As long as I'm alive, they'll use me to hunt, use my voice, my memories. How do you think they knew to call you son? How do you think they knew you'd come? The helicopters were getting closer. Searchlights swept the forest. The creatures retreated further, their hisses fading. Dad looked at me one last time. Tell your mother I'm sorry. Tell her I loved her. I loved you both. But this is the only way to break the chain. He dove. I screamed, plunged after him, but the water was dark and cold and impossibly deep. I searched until my lungs burned, dove again and again until strong hands pulled me out. RCMP tactical officers shouting questions I couldn't answer. They never found his body. The official report said he drowned, possibly suicide, after suffering a psychological break related to past trauma. They found evidence of the creatures, the skin trophies, the shelters, bones that didn't quite match any known animal. But no bodies, no proof of what we'd both seen. The missing officers were never found either. I told them everything, but I could see in their eyes they didn't believe me. Trauma, they said. Hallucinations brought on by stress and fear. They recommended therapy. Winston drove me back to Wrigley the next day. He didn't ask what happened, didn't need to. He'd seen that hollow look before in others who'd come back from the lake. Before I left for Portland, he gave me a small leather pouch. Said it was protection, blessed by the elders. I don't know if I believe in that stuff, but I keep it with me anyway. Mom never forgave Dad for leaving. Even after I told her everything, she refused to believe it. Said he'd abandoned us for some fantasy, some delusion he'd carried for decades. Maybe she's right. Maybe it's easier to believe that than the alternative. But sometimes, late at night, I hear things. A voice that sounds like Dad's, calling from outside my window, telling me he's sorry, telling me to come outside so we can talk. I never answer. I never look. I just hold that leather pouch and wait for morning. Because I know it's not him. It's them, using his voice, his memories, the things that took Susan, the things that have been hunting in those woods for God knows how long, the things that are still out there, waiting. Sometimes I think about going back, about finishing what Dad started. But then I remember those eyes in the darkness, that laughter like breaking glass, and I know I'm not that brave. So I live with it. The knowledge that there are places in this world where humans aren't the apex predators, where things that wear our faces and speak with our voices wait in the darkness, patient and hungry. I never go camping anymore, never hike alone. And when people ask about my dad, I tell them he died in a car accident. It's easier than the truth. Because the truth is that monsters are real. They live in the deep woods of northern Canada, in places where the trees grow too close and the animals know better than to venture. They take our loved ones and wear their skins and speak with their voices, and there's nothing we can do about it except stay away. Stay in the light, stay with others, and whatever you do, if you hear a familiar voice calling from the darkness, don't answer. Don't ever answer.
If you enjoy any of these stories, please leave a like so the algorithm can share this to more like us, and subscribe for more stories like this. If you dare.